When a judge bangs a gavel, we have this picture in our minds, right? That the decision comes from this place of pure logic, of just unshakable certainty. But what if that's not what's happening at all? What if, behind those black robes and all those legal texts, the judicial mind is running on a totally different and very human operating system? So let's dive into this and really try to uncover the psychology of how a verdict is actually reached. So this quote from Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., it just cuts right to the heart of the matter. We all want the law to be certain, don't we? To be this bedrock of stability we can rely on. But what Holmes is telling us here is that searching for that absolute certainty, well, it's a fool's errand. And that's a really provocative idea, one that kind of challenges everything we think we know about justice. Okay, so to understand what's really going on, first we have to kind of take apart this ideal image we all carry around in our heads. This myth of the judge as some perfect logical machine. Yeah, there's actually a name for this idea, mechanical jurisprudence. And it's basically the belief that a judge just takes the facts of a case, feeds them into this machine of legal rules, and bam, out pops the one single correct answer. It's a really appealing image, right? And it gets reinforced by the way judicial opinions are written. They have this style of ultimate certainty, like the conclusion was always obvious. But this confident facade, it's hiding a much more complex and, frankly, messy reality. So, if judges aren't these flawless logic engines, then what are they? How does the human brain actually grapple with the crazy amount of ambiguity and conflict you find in a really tough legal case? Well, the answer, it seems, lies in a psychological model that sees the mind not as a logic engine, but as something called a coherence engine. And this is the mind's real operating system for making complex decisions. So instead of some kind of linear, step-by-step logical proof, the mind uses a process called constraint satisfaction. Now, what does that mean? It means your brain treats all the conflicting arguments in a case, the evidence, the laws, the past cases, as one big interconnected web. The brain's goal isn't to find the single logically correct answer. Its goal is to shift and adjust that entire web until it all just settles into a stable, coherent picture where everything seems to point in the same direction. Okay, so here's how that process actually works. Your mind takes in this messy tangle of arguments. Then, all at once, in parallel, it starts adjusting their weights. So, arguments that support each other, they get stronger. Arguments that contradict each other, they get weaker. And this just happens over and over again until a whole network settles into this state of maximum coherence. And just like that, the ambiguity vanishes. And suddenly, one outcome just feels obvious, almost inevitable. This is literally how the brain manufactures certainty out of chaos. You can think of it like that Necker cube illusion. You know the one I'm talking about, that line drawing of a cube, where you can see it facing one way, and then with just a mental shift, your perception completely flips, and now it's facing the other way. The lines on the page didn't change at all, but your brain's coherent interpretation of them did. Well, a legal case is just like that. A judge can be looking at the exact same set of facts and arguments, and with one mental shift, see a perfectly coherent story that favors the plaintiff. And then with another shift, see a totally different but equally coherent story that favors the defendant. Okay, so if the mind is a coherence engine, then we have to talk about the bugs in the software, right? What happens when this incredibly powerful system gets led astray by these little cognitive glitches? Well, the fundamental truth is judges are human. And decades of psychological research have shown empirically that they're absolutely not immune to the same cognitive biases that affect all of us. Their fancy legal training doesn't make them superhuman. Let's look at a really concrete example, something called the anchoring effect. In one fascinating study, researchers gave a bunch of federal judges the exact same personal injury case. Now, the control group was simply asked to figure out the damages. But the other group, first they had to rule on a completely meritless motion to dismiss the case because it supposedly didn't meet the $75,000 minimum for that court. That number, 75 grand, that's the anchor. And even though the judges knew it was totally irrelevant to the actual damages, the effect it had on their final decision was just staggering. Get this, the judges who were exposed to that low, irrelevant number awarded on average $350,000 less than the control group. That is a nearly 30% reduction in the damage award, all triggered by a number that they themselves knew was legally meaningless. But their coherence engine, it latched onto it anyway. And you see this same pattern popping up everywhere. The myth is that a judge can just unring the bell, and ignore evidence they've ruled as inadmissible. But the reality, which studies have shown time and again, is that hearing about something like a prior criminal conviction, it still influences their final judgment, even after they've officially ruled to exclude it. The same thing happens with hindsight bias. Once a judge knows how something turned out, they consistently overestimate how predictable that outcome was from the start. So these cognitive glitches, they aren't just some academic curiosity. They create real, actual vulnerabilities in the justice system. And of course, where there's a vulnerability, there are always people looking to exploit it. This is where we move beyond unintentional bias and into the world of deliberate manipulation. The key link here is something called discretion. Public officials, and that includes judges, have the power to hand out valuable benefits and impose serious costs. This power, this kind of mental leeway, is exactly what creates the opportunity for corruption. A bribe is basically just an incentive payment designed to push that coherence-seeking brain toward one particular outcome. That cognitive bug we talked about, it becomes a feature for anyone looking to exploit the system. And if you look at this on an even larger scale, these principles have actually been weaponized. The whole modern concept of cognitive warfare is built on this exact foundation, deliberately exploiting an opponent's psychological processes to mess with their decision-making and gain an advantage. So yeah, all of this paints a pretty unsettling picture of the judicial mind, doesn't it? Which raises a huge question. What does this all mean for our entire system of justice? I mean, it's the unavoidable question, right? If the very people we entrust to make these critical decisions are subject to these deep-seated cognitive illusions and vulnerabilities, can we really have confidence in the system? Is the whole thing just fundamentally flawed? Well, it's not quite that simple. The system isn't completely defenseless. You could say it's evolved a series of software patches to try and mitigate these bugs. For instance, the requirement to write a detailed legal opinion that forces a judge to move from their initial, intuitive feeling of coherence to a much more rigorous, logical justification. There are also rules for judicial recusal, which allow a judge to step away from a case if they know they've been exposed to some powerfully biasing information. And then you have things like whistleblower protections, which create incentives for people inside the system to expose corruption whenever it does take root. So in the end, I think we're left with this. Justice isn't something handed down by a perfect, infallible machine. It's the product of a very fallible human mind, with all of its biases and all of its shortcuts, that's just constantly trying to build a coherent story out of chaos. And I guess the final question we're left to think about is that very human, coherence-seeking process ultimately a flaw in our system of justice, or is it an essential feature?